Thank you. It is great to finally be here in Transylvania Presbytery and to have an opportunity to see individuals who are advocates for justice and who have some sense of what it means to collectively come together on a day like this to discuss and to build upon the work that has been done and is being done right now. I am J. Herbert Nelson, Director of the Presbyterian Church USA Office of Public Witness in Washington, D.C. We advocate for the social justice policy approved, and I underscore approved, by the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA. It is not my policy, as many people think that it is, and many of the emails that we get reflect that. But it is the policy that is approved by the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA. Our office has been in Washington, D.C. since 1943. And so Presbyterians over the years in General Assemblies have generally kept up with current policies or a current need for policy regarding social justice in the United States and abroad. And so it is a pleasure to go to work every day in Washington, D.C. And my prayer as I share with individuals daily is, Lord, keep me humble. And I will say a little bit more about why that prayer definitely needs to be prayed every day. I want to also share that it was good to be here tonight with, I should say last night, with individuals who I had a chance to travel to Cuba with back in the year 2000 from Transylvania Presbytery, who are here this morning. And we spent some time with the Tuskegee Airmen and the 7th anniversary, in a sense, of their work as a chapter here in the Lexington area. And it was a great affair and an opportunity to be reacquainted with individuals who I've shared a very, very life-changing, actually, experience with, at least in my own life, with regards to visiting Cuba. I was fortunate enough to actually get a free night at a hotel from a silent auction last night. All I need now is 2 basketball tickets to the University of Kentucky to come see a game on that free night that I have. Wink, wink. But it is good. It is good to be here in Transylvania Presbytery. The challenge today, and I want to begin with what I think is a formidable challenge in the political sphere in the United States. We are seeing the erosion over and over again of the rights that have ultimately been given to citizens in the United States. The Citizens United case back in 2010, settled by the Supreme Court, has given corporations the opportunity to basically see themselves as individuals. This unlimited PAC money that we see coming into the national election process, where we are seeing millions of dollars being spent on small congressional districts across the country. One of the realities of that now is that these corporations have basically engaged Washington, D.C. in such a way that our politicians are really no longer beholden to us except at a ballot box. Because the reality is that corporate money is not only long, but it is very influential in what these politicians have to do in order to remain in office. The name of the game now is having enough money to pay for campaigns. And corporations could care less whether it is a Republican or a Democrat who gets in office. They give money to both candidates. Whoever wins, those individuals have a responsibility to pay that money back through their votes. And what we are seeing is a legislative agenda that is carved out to make that happen. The whole issue around taxation for the rich in the United States is crippled by the money that is coming into these campaigns. Because who else do the politicians then represent except the rich and the wealthy and the corporate leaders? And so one of the challenges that we have in relationship to understanding the formidable challenge of democracy in the United States is how do we recover that in such a way that we are able to push back against the prevailing powers today, which is the corporate leadership that we see occupying seats in Washington, D.C. And I think that is a formidable challenge, and I want to say a little bit more about that a little bit later. I think the other formidable challenge that we are dealing with is even if we look at the settlement of this most recent case with Hobby Lobby, it is pushing back, one, on the issues of religious liberty and who now is able to claim a stake in religious liberty. And corporations now have been able, are able, to act almost as religious institutions on the grounds of hiring, on the grounds of asking for information to be given, particularly as it relates to women. With regards to not hiring individuals, we are seeing a strong movement in the state of Tennessee around having to release medical information on a job and the determination that if a woman has previously had an abortion, that woman can actually be fired on the grounds of having an abortion and as a religious issue in the workplace. And so here's an encroachment now upon religion. Here's an encroachment now upon what it means to be a citizen of the United States. And when we begin to see these kinds of, this kind of leverage being given to corporate structures, the real question is what do they do with that when they are in the business of making money? And how do they utilize that as a tool of oppression, suppression, and also of making more money off of, in a sense, the enslavement of people who no longer have the rights and powers that they once did. This is a critical time in the history of our country. It really is. Those who fought for democracy, those who struggled for what it meant to have conversations in the public square that mattered, even under street lights up in New England, who stood around and debated in the evening with crowds as a formidable sense of debate. I would say, as we say down in South Carolina where I grew up, these folks are turning over in their graves right now at what they are seeing as the emergence of what we now frame as a democratic society and a place with freedom and liberty and justice for all. This is a critical time, and I don't think I can express that enough today, with regards to where the political sphere is in relationship to pressing back on the rights of people. Now, on the flip side of that, it is a critical time with the angst in the life of the church. We are in a time of declining membership in the Presbyterian Church. We're in a time of having to rethink what it means to be Christian, not because there is something that is wrong with the Presbyterian Church, but the world has changed. And another generation of young people that are growing up are becoming distanced from the life of the church, because if we think about the institutions in our society that have failed to change, they are generally the institutions that have been grounded in the historic development of our society. The school, public education, is in need of some serious reform today. It is a long-term movement of education in the United States, deeply connected to how we educate children to get jobs and job training. And yet, when I go in classrooms today and talk to teachers, 50 minutes, 45 to 50 minutes of their time is spent on classroom discipline. Methodologies of teaching this generation of young people who can go on a weekend to Six Flags or somewhere, and they're yelling and screaming and they're hollering all weekend long. And as I was taught in classrooms today, you can't ask these children on Monday morning to sit down at their desk and open to page 25 and let's talk about the lesson. Children who, quite frankly, are engaging a world where they're going to be asked to work with others and work collectively in groups. And yet we are still teaching children in terms of how to develop as individuals, individual test scores, sit at your desk and do your work. And yet when they come into the workplace, we wonder why we have all these problems in the workplaces, because they're now forced to go into a workplace and interact with others and depend upon others in order to get their job done. But that's not how we educate them in the United States, because historically we've not done that. The church is the same. We are in church settings today where young people have grown up. My daughter in particular has grown up with one of these in her pocket. And if you look at the one I have today, it is the iPhone 4. They just came out with an iPhone 6. And so I'm still behind in all of this. One of the realities is, how do we teach young people who gain a great deal of their information just like that? They aren't looking in dictionaries like we used to look. They aren't looking in other places for information or going to the library to do all of this research on a particular issue. You can ask them a question, and within 30 seconds, they can give you the answer. And yet, how do we educate young people in this kind of environment? But how do we keep their attention in church on Sunday morning? In a fast-paced, fast-moving environment where things happen very quickly, where they move in and out, where they are moved in some instances away from the printed word, what does all of that now mean? And we're struggling with that in our own denomination, and we're trying to find a quick fix for it. And the reality is that it is very difficult to find a quick fix with the continued emerging of technology and the struggles that we're going through in keeping up with the world as fast as it is moving. This has to be a way by which we do some real dedicated and committed thinking to looking at models that work and begin to look ahead of this generation and see where the world is going. But that's very difficult for churches to do, because we, like other traditional institutions, want things to remain the same. That's a major challenge today. And so here on one end, the political sphere is locked into gaining all of the rights of individuals, of acting as individuals and taking over this whole massive structure of not only the United States government, but your household and mine, with drones and everything else that they have today. And at the same time, we're trying to figure out how to prepare another generation to engage a political process and to see the validity in it, and also help shape their lives and their thinking for the future ahead. I was looking at a special just the other day in which there were employers who were basically saying that young people who go to college have lost 4 years in terms of their workforce and ability to earn a living. The college really, in terms of the downgrading of our economy right now, is not necessary. I don't necessarily agree with that. But this was a statement, and they were showing young people who are now called gray-collar workers. That means they don't have any jobs in their major after finishing school, and they don't make very much money. Sometimes they only make minimum wage. And I was with a college chaplain last year who told me that there were young people who came from affluent homes, graduated from this very upscale college with a great reputation, but could not find work. And one of the struggles was they went to nursing homes and had jobs like that where they had to buy their own gloves. And they were working, in a sense, as a part of the labor force, making just above minimum wage with a 4-year degree. And that was not their major. And so the challenges today of how this economy is impacting our society, the transformation of the society, and how fast and rapid it is moving. And then on the other side of that, the encroachment on the rights of people are all coming together and converging. And it means that we are pushed further and further away from the ability to earn a living, further and further away from the ability to make decisions about our society and engage that, and further away in the life of the church of being able to give some moral, ethical, and spiritual grounding in relationship to faith. Now, one of the great challenges that I deal with from time to time is Presbyterians saying to me that they don't understand why we even need to have an office in Washington, D.C. And I have to ask them the question, are you Presbyterian? I mean, really, are you Presbyterian? Because if you're Presbyterian, you understand that John Calvin, in his part of the Reformation, was very clear that the church had to be actively engaged in the public sphere. The founder of our denomination declared that it is the civil magistrate, the elected official, that is, in fact, the most important person in the life of the community and the most important decision maker, because they make so many decisions about our lives and the relationships of our lives ultimately to the Almighty. It was John Calvin who did not give his works to the Smithsonian Institute of his day, but instead gave them to the elected officials of Geneva, Switzerland, in hopes that his inspired writings about God would change their mind and give them some sense of how they ought to govern more effectively for the lives of people. And then in North America, when we begin to look at it, I urge you to get one of these pamphlets and to look at the timeline. You have a lot of papers in here, but look at the timeline that is in the folder of Presbyterian engagement in social justice. And it's on both sides of this folder. And Eugene Carson Blake standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington, as it is called now, but it was actually the March for Jobs and Justice. And he was speaking on behalf of the National Council of Churches, that ecumenical body of Christian churches. And his response that day was basically that the white church has come on late in this movement, but we're here now. And I think that's a powerful moment of being a speaker. Not only does it mean being Presbyterian to engage in the issues of justice, but it means that we are ecumenical. It means that we are interfaith. It means that we don't believe that we are the only ones that know something about God. And God's desire is for the world, that it is the collective possibilities of people of faith that broadens our awareness of what it means to know God and offers us an opportunity to build unity around who God is and is in the relationship with us. But let's go back a little bit further. I always have to go to these words as found in the Gospel of Luke, Luke 4. It is Jesus who comes into the temple. It is Jesus who opens the scroll and reads out of Isaiah. And it is recorded in Luke again, as in the Old Testament prophet Isaiah. Hear his words, his mission statement, Jesus' mission statement. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me and has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. Oh, these are great words, great words. And it is no wonder that when he preached that in the temple, he closed the scroll after those words. And when he preached that in the temple, it is no wonder that they ultimately questioned him in his hometown. And they ran him out of town. Can you hear what is being said? The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. The poor. It's a fluent Jewish temple. And he's saying he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor. What kind of renegade preacher is this? He doesn't know who we are. He doesn't know what we're struggling with. For we're trying to figure out ways to imprison the poor. We're trying to find out ways to get them away from us so that we can have all of the loot and run off with it. And Jesus comes in and challenges from the very beginning. My mission, my ministry is to engage poor people. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives. The captives. Those who are dealing with what Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, talks about. Those who are felons and can't vote when they get out of jail, out of prison after serving their time. Those who are felons and who are watched each and every day of their lives and caught up in a criminal justice system that has them checking in so much to the criminal justice system that they really can't live productive lives. I was arrested a few years ago praying in the Capitol Rotunda, and out of that we were dealing with the failure of the government to come to an understanding that they needed to lift the spending limit for the president. And in so doing, a group of us, Michael Livingston, Presbyterian, Jennifer Butler, who works for Faith in Public Life, used to lead the United Nations office in Washington for the Presbyterian, in New York for the Presbyterian Church. 3 of us out of the 11 were Presbyterians. We got arrested in the Capitol Rotunda. And one of the interesting pieces around that was that we had a chance to see what the criminal justice system was like. The long lines. I had to go down and take a drug test. I had to be drug tested every week. And the long lines wrapped around, comes to the end of the corridor, and then wraps around the line on the other side of the room or of the corridor. The long lines in the morning waiting to get in. The checks with individuals who were trying to go through security to get in the morning. Took 30 minutes to get in through security. This is every day, every single day. And if you look around the country, in just about every village and hamlet, the courthouse downtown is facing the same thing each and every day. And venture to go into it and see people running around and know, in a sense, more law than the lawyers because they've been down there so much. And so there's a connection between this whole issue of what it means to be a part of being captive, being imprisoned, being burdened and bound, and what it means to be poor in the United States. And this is what Jesus proclaims he's going to make a connection to. Recovery of sight to the blind, those who cannot see. It's not just simply healing, it is those who have an inability to see beyond their own station and place in life. Those who historically have been left behind, Native Americans in the United States, African Americans in the United States, other people of color, now these new immigrants, 12 million, 11 million of them waiting to get in this kind of subclass of citizenship, where they are citizens on one hand when it comes to work illegally, with people who actually are running legitimate and legal businesses, but then they are illegal when it comes to an ICE lockup or break-in at 4 o'clock in the morning. And I thank God that we have 2 churches, Southside Presbyterian Church out in Tucson and University Presbyterian Church in Tempe, Arizona, that have now begun a process of redeveloping the sanctuary movement all over again. And right now have individuals in their churches with ICE and everyone else standing out. And they cannot go in to get these individuals because they've declared sanctuary. And that might be something you want to think about in this area. And then Jesus says to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord's favor. The oppressed, those broken, despised, dejected, demeaned, and damned by this society. The oppressed. You know, oppression happens in cycles. William Julius Wilson writes a powerful piece on this issue of how in Chicago we are looking at the transformation of a community. Individuals who were working and the jobs were in the inner city. And as they were working day by day, they lived in a sense middle-class lives to a degree. They were able to feed their families. They were able to clothe themselves. They were able to make ends meet, if nothing else. But the jobs were in the inner city. And in Chicago, there was a move in the 70s to suburbanize the jobs. The jobs were moved out to the suburbs, and they redlined the transportation system. So that means simply that it doesn't go far enough to get the persons to those jobs. It stopped before it got to the suburbs. So we are seeing a clear division between suburban America and inner city America. But as the jobs moved out, these individuals in the inner city did not have jobs anymore. And there was an underground economy always waiting for them. And now the underground economy started to flourish. The gun running, the drug sales, the prostitution. Because these individuals, after a while of not being able to work, started to drink, started to use drugs, and started to take all of these things as anesthesia for their pain. The worth of men, and particularly African-American men, was devalued by the fact that they could not find a job. And so some of them turned to selling drugs. And no lawyer, when they were locked up, ever asked the question, or no judge ever asked the question, how long have you been selling drugs? No judge ever became a pastoral counselor in court and said, how is it that 18 months ago, I see you had no record, but now you're caught with all of these drugs? No, the politicians, the district attorneys, and the legal system began to lift up 3 strikes you're out. We're going to be tough on crime. We're going to lock people up for longer sentences. And it is amazing that some people are still in jail for marijuana charges and drug charges, and we're about to legalize marijuana all over the country. It is an amazing thing. And yet, these individuals ended up in jail trying to make a living for their families. Doesn't make it right, but what other opportunity did they have? And I don't know about you, but it put in a desperate situation that sometimes I don't know what I would do in order to feed my family. And so we locked more and more people up. And then the jails became overcrowded, and somebody got the bright idea, if we can't make money on these people outside of jail, then we're going to make money on them inside the jail. And so we started privatizing prisons, and the spouses of our elected officials started serving on the boards of these privatized prisons, still do. And this became a very lucrative business now of locking individuals up. The gentleman who did the shooting on the corner, at the Congress on the corner in Tucson, the state of Nevada and the state of California were fighting to get him in their prison system because they knew that that would be one bed that would be filled for a very long time. He had a life sentence. And if you can fill beds, the state will pay you in privatized prisons to fill those beds. And so we are fighting now for people as a commodity to lock them up in the United States. And so our struggle against privatized prisons, mass incarceration, our struggle against these sentencing laws that are antiquated and are still in vogue now to lock people up for long term. This is one of the major issues we are dealing with now. And yet, we recognize that that is a part of letting the oppressed go free. Because there's no rehabilitation in our prison systems today. Folks come out worse than they were when they went in, with no skills, no ability to do anything, and all of the tricks of the trade in their mind as to how to hustle and how to kill and how to take all over again. They become professional criminals. And so there is a need for us to engage this particular issue. There is a need for us to engage the issue of proclaiming the acceptable year of the Lord, the year of Jubilee, the day of debt release. This is what he is proclaiming. Jesus is saying every 7 years. It was a part of the understanding and coming out of Leviticus that debts would be relieved, that individuals, the debts that were held over their heads would be taken away from them and they could start fresh and new. You hear this kind of radical transformation of our corporate structures today as that happens? Folks ringing our phones 10, 11 times a day. You're scared to pick up the telephone. You're scared to and now they're saying, you 7 years after that's done, no longer will you have an obligation to deal with these debt collectors. The slate is white clean, and you get a new start, a new ability to move. What about countries like Haiti, who we've been holding the debt over their head forever, controlling their governments, electing their leaders, and putting money into the places where we wanted to put them in as a government here in the United States? We're suggesting that that has to end. This domination, this control, this belief that we have to be the most powerful in the world for the sake of boasting of power, and somehow the ethic of love is bleached out of all of that. And we have no obligation to love our neighbors next door. which Jesus redefined in the parable of the Good Samaritan as being anyone whom God has created in the likeness and image of God. Our neighbor is everyone created by God. So not just next door, but whoever we come in contact with. And to do that, we have to act as though we love them. My daughter could never repay me for the money that I've given her. Never. And haven't stopped giving it to her either. Could never repay me. And out of love, I will never ask for it. Never ask for it. And this is not to say that we ought to just simply be bad creditors. It's not to say that. But it suggests that somehow or another, if children need medicine and we have it, and they can't access it, that there should not be a debt held over their head that declares that unless you can pay us back, we're going to take everything and strip you of everything and even your dignity as a country. There's something wrong with that. And so what we are pushing for is not free trade, but fair trade. We are preaching and pushing for economic reciprocity. We are suggesting that when we set up trade agreements with countries, we should not repeat what we did with NAFTA. And that is a major reason why individuals are standing at our border today, wanting to come in for the economic freedom that we promised through a trade agreement that they have not yet seen. We're suggesting the same thing when it comes down to Colombia Free Trade Agreement. Somehow or another, this wayward and slanted free trade agreement ultimately is the product we're seeing is our children showing up at our borders now. And so also with the other parts of the world. The issue is not free trade. The issue for us deals with fair trade. And can we in the United States be about the business of fair trade with our neighbors and our partners? And now this Trans-Pacific Partnership that is emerging, and fast track, where all of the negotiations can be done undercover, and we know nothing about it. There's no public record for us to look at. We are seeing information sequestered in ways that if we are really talking about government of the people, for the people, and by the people, we the people ought to be able to have some access to. But negotiations with these countries who are our neighbors, and we have no means of accessing it. I want to say one more thing, and I want to stop for questions because there are many places I could go with this today. But one of the greatest pieces that we're going to need to push in this particular age is something called voter suppression. Voter suppression. You see, when we are struggling on one level of having rights taken away with regards to the Supreme Court, Hobby Lobby with the church and religious institutions. On the other side, the issue of Citizens United, and as citizens we're sharing our rights with corporations who are acting as individuals. And now the test case in North Carolina, where a renegade group of leaders have come in and basically tried to push North Carolina back into the dark ages. I grew up in a place called one of the more progressive states here in the United States, called South Carolina. North Carolina was looked at to be more progressive than we were, quite frankly. And I'm kidding about South Carolina being progressive, but North Carolina was seen pretty much as the progressive state of the South. They figured out how to work things out as opposed to going through these strenuous fights. And it did not mean that the Greensboro Four and North Carolina A&T were not a part of sit-in movement. It doesn't mean that they didn't have movements and those types of pieces. But they had a way of moving in a direction that kept a focus on where they were trying to go. And so they worked certain things out. South Carolina was very different. Mississippi, Alabama, very different. I mean, if you think of North Carolina, there is no George Wallace standing in front of a student trying to get into the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Didn't mean they didn't have segregation. But you don't see that kind of poised stance because it's not, quote, the North Carolina way. And now North Carolina, because of, I believe, that history, is a swing state. And so the challenge of big money now is to go into North Carolina and push all of that back. Because there's always the belief that as the South goes, so also does a segment of the United States outside of the South in dealing with more repressive laws and more repressive struggles with people who are on the margins. It is when Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill. And his response to that was, well, there goes the South. And the South was important in the electoral process then, it is important now. And so the attack is on the last bastion of some level of moderate behavior in the South. And if we can trap North Carolina, we've already got the rest of the South. And out of that, we can have this deep corporate push to begin to take over the market of states throughout the country, and especially those that are not real progressive states, i.e. California, New York, places like that that are just kind of off the chart in the other direction. Voter ID. I've never voted in my life without a voter ID. They call it a voter registration card. And if I didn't have one on me, they had a roll in a list of registered voters. And I've had neighbors, and I've also had church members who worked at the precinct where I voted. And on election day, I walked up and I said, "How you doing?" And they said, "I'm doing fine, Reverend. Good to see you today. Church was great on Sunday." They said that most of the time. They didn't say anything if it wasn't. I said, "Glad you're here to vote today." And they paused. Because it didn't matter that I was their pastor. It didn't matter that I was their neighbor. They needed a voter registration card. They needed to check my name off of that list. And now when you talk about voter ID, my grandmother was 101 years old. She died at 103, but at 101, she went into a nursing home. And slowly there was movement toward her death over the next 2 years. Last election, 2012, she died right before that election, or right after that election. The state of South Carolina would have required my 103-year-old grandmother, who had given up her driver's license at the age of 101, to go now and get a picture ID in order to vote. The voter registration card that I got in South Carolina as a teenager, I should say, when I turned legal, over 18, that voter registration card wasn't good enough for a 103-year-old woman to cast her vote in the state of South Carolina. This hoop jumping with electoral processes. There are countries that vote for months because people have to walk to the polls. There are countries that have polling places open every day before an election. There are countries that spend a great deal of time making sure that individuals get to the polls to vote and that no one is left out. And here we are in the country, the land of the free and the home of the brave, restricting the rights of individuals to vote and making it more difficult. And so if on one end they buy the politicians with the money and their vote, and on the other end they lock us out of the process, government of the people, for the people, and by the people, becomes government of the corporation, for the rich and wealthy, and by those who are looking for tax breaks amid their wealth. It's a challenging time. And I want to ask and commission each and every one of you that we all have to get off of our blessed assurance and do something to reframe the context of this nation, for God's sake. for God's